It's really lovely to be here. And thank you so much for your welcome. Thank you for coming here. It feels like we are standing on holy ground. It's always the case when we speak about faith and when we speak about people of different faiths and when we talk about our own faith in relation to people of other faiths, that we're aware that we are walking on holy ground, because the things that we talk about are really deep to us, and the potential for hurt is also very deep. And we're not just talking about abstract academic theology, if you like, although there is a place for that, but we're talking about people's lives and our own relationships. And I hope that we can bring those two together a bit here today, because I hope we can talk about, basically the theological question of what it means as Christians to be engaging with Muslims, but also actually how that works out in practice. Also here in Harrogate, because in Harrogate we have a community of Muslims who don't have a mosque. And there is a question for Harrogate, and there's a question for churches in Harrogate as to how we respond to that. I used to be a vicar in Birmingham, and I was interfaith advisor to the Bishop of Birmingham at a time when the Muslims of Solihull were wanting to build a mosque, all right? And these were basically rich, educated, deeply engaged, really wonderfully kind people. And so, of course, the response from Solihull was, not on your life. It was a difficult conversation with the churches too. It's a question where you get one bite at the cherry, you know, and people remember, where were the churches in that discussion, and what are we talking about, and what's going on, and where it brings us to is that the conversation we're having today, as it were, on holy ground, and in my mind, it's a bit too cold, but otherwise I would have taken my shoes off. But in a sense, spiritually and emotionally, we need to be taking our shoes off, is that we are in the middle of a culture war in which Muslims are footballs and are kicked around a lot and are talked about a lot in a deeply bruising way. In some ways, what we're doing today is a difficult thing, and I want to kind of make a plea for its possibility even, because today is not interfaith dialogue. We could have set this up in that way. We could have had a Muslim and a Christian speaker. We could have had, that could have been kind of more in terms of apologetics, or it could have been discussion about common issues that we have. But I've deliberately not done it that way. And that's not to say that there isn't a place for that, and a really important place for that. But I think there is also a place for having an internal discussion among ourselves about where we're at with our engagement with people of other faiths. So Jesus talked to people from different faith backgrounds. He talked to Samaritans, to Gentiles, but he also talked about them. He gave the story, for example. He told the story of the Good Samaritan, somebody who we've just read, Jews and Samaritans didn't get on very well. But he talked about Samaritans as well as talking with Samaritans. The Prophet Muhammad, he talked to Christians and Jews and others, but he also talked with his own followers about Christians and Jews. And I think there is that space, and I want to argue for the legitimacy of that space. So while I welcome very much our Muslim sisters and brothers here, I've talked to our Imam, and I've asked him at some point to just get up here in the front and reflect back for us what he's seen and heard. And I think it'd be really, really helpful if you can do that. And I'd be really grateful. Don't need to if you don't want to, but be really grateful if you could. And we'll hear from everybody here. But that's the wider context. And I think it's an important one, and it's one that we must take very seriously, and one that we must approach, as it were, as holy ground. So, so I think I want to begin with the context of Islamophobia, because Islamophobia is kind of raised its ugly, it's there a lot, but it's raised its ugly head, particularly over the last couple of weeks. There was a YouGov poll that came out on Wednesday, I don't know if anybody saw that, which kind of picked up on Baroness Varsi's comment that Islamophobia has sort of passed the dinner table test. It's something which is acceptable in a way that other forms of racism aren't, and particularly among more educated people. So apparently from this study from the University of Birmingham, 25.9% of Brits feel negative about Muslims. So a quarter of our population feels negatively about Muslims. A quarter of people agree that there are no-go areas in our country where non-Muslims are not able to enter. And that's up to 43% when it comes to Conservative or Brexit Leave voters. 36%, again rising to 57% when it's people who voted for the Conservative Party, agree that Islam threatens the British way of life. And 18.1% want all Muslim migration to the UK to be stopped completely, or people to be deported. So that's the context in which we are talking. And it's easy to think about those numbers, in some ways to be shocked by those numbers or not shocked. But of course, all those numbers are people. So I've got friends whose hijabs have been ripped off in public, or who are regularly worried when they go to London and are standing on a tube on an underground platform because they're not quite sure if somebody's going to push them into the path of an oncoming train, which has happened. So there's a constant state of wariness among many of my Muslim friends, and almost a normalcy in what actually is hate crime sometimes. And we know that just recently, Nuzgani, the first Muslim MP to speak at the dispatch box as a minister, claiming that she was dismissed from her post, partly because of her Muslimness. And Kari Asim, one of our most prominent Muslim imams, a close friend of mine, having been asked by the government to help the government come up with an accepted definition of Islamophobia, then saying publicly that he's written to the government for 2 years and has not even got responses. So we've got a problem. I'm not making party political points here. I'm just saying we've got a problem. And I think particularly for me, there were a couple of points where I was interested. One of them was more positive, that I've heard for a while the claim that in general, Anglican Christians are more Islamophobic than other people. But actually, this piece of research says not, which is interesting. And there's very high levels of Islamophobia among Anglican Christians, but particularly among practicing Anglicans, that is actually less. And that's quite encouraging thing for me. If you take away other effects of age and demographics and other things. So that was quite helpful. But what was particularly striking was that levels of Islamophobia are higher among more educated upper and middle class people, which is really interesting. And I think, and the study seems to indicate or kind of, or wonders why that is, and that is probably because more educated people think they know what Islam is about. For example, that the Quran can only be taken literally and that there's no interpretation possible. That was one of the questions asked. And that more educated people are more willing to say, right, that's a fact. And rather than be willing to say, well, I'm not quite sure because it's not my faith and let's ask a Muslim, for example. And that brings me to a quote by David Hume, that great Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, which I first heard from a Jewish professor and friend, Adam Seligman from the University of Boston. So David Hume says, explanation is where the mind rests. Explanation is where the mind rests. And what he's saying, or what that's important to the discussion we're having today, is that it reminds us that our journey as Christians of understanding Muslims, in fact, of understanding anyone or anything, is mostly finished when we get tired and decide we need a rest. So we stop, and where we stop, we say, that's the explanation. I've got it. Don't need to go any further. And many of us clearly are then willing to go around with some confidence to tell other people about our explanation. But really, it isn't an explanation. It's simply the point that we got to when we became either too tired or too lazy or met a prejudice, and then we just stopped inquiring. See what I mean? And I think that's a temptation for all of us all the time. Now, you can push it to the points where David Hume pushed it, and you can get a very relativist, almost logical, positive kind of philosophical piece of thinking that comes out of that. But I think it is a really, really helpful reminder for us, particularly coming out of that YouGov poll, about what the issues are. And I asked for that reading that we just heard from John's Gospel, because I think it speaks very strongly into David Hume's quote. It's a story in which both Jesus and the woman who Jesus meets, drawing water in the middle of the day, the whole story is about them moving beyond where their minds have rested, if you like. It's a story about risky engagement. The woman is a woman, a Samaritan, drawing water in the middle of the day, presumably because she doesn't want to meet everybody else, because they talk about her. She's presumably not terribly theologically educated, and yet she's seriously feisty and prepared to get involved in kind of theological mud wrestling with a Jewish rabbi, which is not something that you would do if you thought that you'd get flattened by it. Jesus is willing to ask for a drink, even though he knows that many of his own people would say that makes him unclean. He ends up staying in the village for a couple of days, which means he actually has to sleep there and eat there, which means that he has become unclean in terms of his own religious practice. And he's prepared to engage and be challenged. So there's a process of not letting the mind rest. And I hope that that is an encouragement and an inspiration for us to do the same in our own thinking and our own relationships. And I should explain that I believe there is a relation, that the relationship between Jews and Samaritans in the first century has strong parallels with the relationship between Christians and Muslims today. If you're a Muslim and want to know about Christianity, Christianity is talked about in the Quran and the Muslim corpus, if you like. But because Islam in that sense came after Christianity, we don't have a lot of Muslims in the Bible. And so it can be kind of a question, so where do we find our resources for this engagement? And one of the biggest resources, and I've argued it elsewhere, kind of why I think that, but one of the biggest resources is the relationship between Jews and Samaritans in the first century. Because those communities, Jews and Samaritans, shared a lot of history, they shared a lot of theology, they shared a lot of common background. For example, both of them shared a common scripture, the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses. But there was also a huge amount of difference: economic, social, historical, theological, scriptural. And we saw that in the reading, where you've got this kind of, which mountain do we have the proper temple on? And I think it's a helpful way of understanding the relationship between Muslims and Christians today, because Muslims and Christians also have a huge amount of shared common ground theologically, actually a shared scripture in the sense of the Torah and the Zabur, the Psalms, which we read from, and the Gospel, taken very seriously, as we know, by Muslims. And yet, there's something which Freud calls the narcissism of the small difference. You know? The narcissism of the small difference. That when you're close to somebody, your disagreements hurt that much more. You know, if you have nothing in common with somebody and they insult you, well, that's just too bad. If your sister insults you, she knows exactly how to do it in such a way that makes it really hurt. And when we are therefore engaging with one another as Muslims and Christians, precisely because we're so close, actually the differences are quite painful, because we are in many ways speaking the same language. And I think, so, you know, go away. I mean, this is not something I'm sure which is new to many of you, but it is something worth looking into, where Samaritans occur in the Bible, to look at it with that lens, as it were. And there's this subtle, particular kind of complex tension which we get to in that passage that we just read. So on the one hand, we have the conversation going quite quickly into this question, which temple is bigger than whose temple? It almost feels like Donald Trump, doesn't it? You know, my temple's bigger than your temple. My temple's in the right place, your temple's in the wrong place. And it was an obvious discussion, because Samaritans believed only in the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures, and where the temple isn't mentioned in the Torah. It's only when you get to the story of David and Samuel that you get to know actually where the temple should be. So it meant that Samaritans had their temple on Mount Gerizim, and then Jews, who have the whole of the Hebrew scriptures, have their temple on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And so this question was, which is the right thing? And Jesus just says, it's actually not on that temple or on this temple at all. God seeks people who worship him in spirit and in truth. So he kind of pushes that kind of cultural almost civilizational debate about who's better than the other into the background and says, actually, that's not where God is at. And yet, at the same time, Jesus is not some kind of postmodern guy who says, well, it's all subjective. Because Jesus says, salvation is from the Jews. It sounds to me like he's saying, you Samaritans actually have got it wrong. You worship what you do not know. And that, of course, is not very easy reading for an Anglican bishop. It's just a little bit exclusivist, a little bit sort of, hyper evangelical. But Jesus still says it. And why is Jesus saying it? What is at stake here? And I think it's interesting what Jesus is saying. He's saying, well, let me not say what he's saying. What I learn from this is that my faith is not just a lifestyle choice. It's not just a thing that I happen to do on a Sunday and you happen to do on a Friday or whatever, and that, or I maybe go to this church, you go to that church, and it doesn't really matter. What I hear Jesus saying is that this actually does matter a great deal, that there are claims about God and the world and myself in the faith that comes from the Jews and which is revealed in Jesus Christ, that are hugely important and crucially that are not self-evident. This is not stuff that just left to ourselves we would come up with. For example, if you're doing the glories of Anglican morning prayer, you will know that we've been going through the early chapters of the book of Genesis. And that story of Cain and Abel is a really fascinating story. Because in that story, you have a good guy, Abel, and a bad guy, Cain. And the bad guy, Cain, kills the good guy, Abel. But what's really interesting in the story is actually that the Bible isn't really that interested in the good guy. It's not really interested in Abel. He just dies. He's murdered. The whole thrust of the story is about what God does with a bad guy, with a murderer. How does God continue to have a relationship with somebody who's done a murder, the first murder? And it's all about almost this kind of wrestling with what God does with bad people. And I think that's basically what the Bible is about, really. God not wanting to let bad people just go to hell, which is the obvious and intuitive thing to do, to say God loves good people and hates bad people. Actually, the Bible and that story is about God loving bad people. Or, even more so, that God's love is revealed supremely in Jesus crucified on a cross, on a Roman cross. And that is the most counterintuitive thing. How could God be revealed in an appalling, sadistic, unclean murder of an innocent person on a cross outside of the city? And yet that is the claim. And I don't know if you've read Tom Holland's it's not his last book, his latest book, but Dominion, which came out a couple of years ago, is basically arguing that just how counterintuitive that message of Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, was in the ancient world. It just is nothing like what you get in Persian or Babylonian or Egyptian or Roman or Greek mythology. It's a completely different way of looking at the world. And he says, actually, it's shaped our modern world. Whether you're a Christian or not, whether you believe it or not, that worshipping of a God who has come to be crucified on a cross has shaped the whole of our civilization. And so when we're confronted by that question, not on this mountain, not on that mountain, but salvation is from the Jews. What do we do with that? What do we do with that? And there are different answers, but there are two particular ones, both which have resonances in the Bible. The first is to say, I keep my faith pure and I preserve the importance of what I have in my faith, which is revealed, by excluding others. So there is and that's it's a strong theme in the Bible. If you read Ezra or Nehemiah, it's a theme which is kind of close to my heart because I'm married to a Dutch woman, and it's all about getting rid of your foreign wives. So I don't have particular kind of warm feelings towards it, but it is there. And it's basically saying, if you want to be pure, you don't hang out with impure people. You hold on to what you know to be right, and it may not be a very nice thing to do, but you keep those other people at bay. And particularly when you feel threatened, as the Jews who are just coming back from Babylonia and trying to rebuild the temple, it's very, very tempting to retreat into ourselves, put up the barriers and say, we keep ourselves pure. And I think that is something which Christians, which many people in Europe are trying to do, of course. It's all, the debate about immigration is big in this. And there is a place for debate, as I was saying before, with Muslims. There's a place for apologetics, but there are real dangers in kind of putting ourselves over against other people, not least because it's very easy to get it wrong when we try to describe other people, and particularly to say, well, there's only, I speak for all of Christianity, and I know what all of Islam is, and it's wrong. And of course, that's what we saw in the YouGov poll, people being too willing too quickly to do that. So that's one way, kind of exclusion. And the other way is embrace, that we say, actually, we need to embrace the other and be big enough to hold the other with all their differences in us. There's a wonderful psalm, Psalm 87, which I just want to read here. On the holy mount stands the city God founded. The Lord loves the gates of Zion, of Jerusalem, more than all the dwellings of Jacob. Glorious things are spoken of you, O city of God. We know the hymn. And then the psalmist goes on to say, among those who know me, I mention Rahab, Babylon, Philistia, Tyre, and Ethiopia. This one was born there in Zion, they say. And of Zion it shall be said, this one and that one were born in it, for the Most High himself will establish it. The Lord records as he registers the peoples, this one was born there. Singers and dancers alike say, all my springs are in you. Echoes of of John 4 and the Samaritan woman. Now, that's a really interesting, different take, isn't it? That's saying all these enemies of Zion, actually God looks at them and says, I count you as part of my work. I count you as part of my people. If you scroll forward to the end of the book of Revelation, there's that wonderful verse which says, the kings of Revelation 21, the kings of the earth will bring their glory into the new Jerusalem. Its gates will never be shut by day. There will be no night there. People will bring into the city the glory and honor of the nations. So there's this kind of embracing inclusivist strand, as well as there's the exclusivist strand. And that's lovely, but that also has its dangers. And I think I became aware of that, particularly in conversations both with Jews and Muslims. So Jews have often said to me they get very annoyed with Christians because we just include them. But we include them as a failed prototype, you know? We love you, and what your religion is basically true in as far as it goes. You just haven't quite got there yet. So just join us and it'll be a lot easier for the both of us. It's the kind of bottom line. And then, of course, I feel the same with with some of the discourse that comes from Muslims, who more or less do that. God gave the religion to the Jews. They basically messed it up, and so God gave it to the Christians. They basically messed it up, started worshipping Jesus, and so it came to the Prophet Muhammad, and we've got Islam. Basically, again, you're all right. We like you. You're okay, but you are a failed prototype. And it's, in some ways, it sounds really nice and liberal and helpful, but it's actually, and it comes into our discourse very often when we talk about Abrahamic faiths. There's a lot of talk about Abrahamic faiths, and some of that's okay, talking about Jews, Muslims, Christians, but some of it I feel is not helpful. It's not helpful, particularly when it's used as a term to exclude Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, people who we don't really want to be part of the discussion. But it's also, I feel, unhelpful when it actually doesn't allow me as a Christian to say who I am, but kind of puts me in a box, when it's effectively saying, here's an Abrahamic box, all the core basic components are the same, there's just a little bit of difference around the edges, but they don't really matter. But actually, they do matter. It does matter if Jesus is the Son of God, and it does matter if Jesus was crucified on a cross. And so don't put me in a box which kind of defines me and doesn't allow me to define myself, just as I need to make sure that I don't put other people in a box which defines them and doesn't allow them to define themselves. And we need to be very careful of that in all our interfaith and all our dialogue with other people. Now, friends, I want to just stop there for a minute. And I've got more to say, but I don't need to say it. But I think that's enough for a begin. And I wonder whether we could maybe have a cup of coffee and be grateful if you were willing to stay with us in the sense of having the conversations over coffee about this, and particularly whether you're at home having a cup of coffee and watching this online, or whether you're here, that we formulate questions and discussion about this, and then we'll come back. I don't know, is it all right if we come back in 10 minutes? 10, 15 minutes?
10, 15 minutes.
10, 15 minutes. And then we'll have a bit of discussion. I'll hopefully take it a little bit further forward, and then we can have another bit of questions. And at that point, it would be great if we can hear from our